Welcome to Biblical Mysteries on Tap. I'm Professor Kenneth Hansen, professor with a Pilsner, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage and pull up a chair while we uncork another mystery from the ancient world. Maybe you've got a local craft IPA. Maybe it's a stout, dark enough to remind you of one of the plagues. Or if you're underage, maybe it's a Diet Coke. No judgment here, because we're solving one of the biggest historical mysteries in the Bible. And honestly, if Hollywood made this story exactly as history might have happened, well, people would complain it was too unbelievable. We've got dreams that change empires, massive engineering projects, climate catastrophe, political intrigue, a family that rises from immigrant shepherds to rulers of Egypt, only to end up making bricks for Pharaoh. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a fellow wearing the most famous multicolored coat in history. Now, here's the question. If Joseph really became the second most powerful man in Egypt, where is he? Seriously, where is he? The Egyptians carved inscriptions celebrating people who supervised quarries. They carved inscriptions celebrating tax collectors. They carved inscriptions celebrating the guy who probably sharpened somebody else's chisel. You're telling me they forgot the man who supposedly saved the kingdom from disaster? Now that seems suspicious. Unless they didn't forget him at all. Maybe we've just been calling him by the wrong name. So, raise your glass, because we're following one of the boldest and certainly most controversial historical theories in biblical archaeology. It's known as David Rohl's New Chronology. David Rohl's New Chronology. Now, before anyone starts composing an angry email, let me be clear, this is not the majority view among Egyptologists. Far from it. But it is one of the most imaginative, evidence-based alternative reconstructions ever proposed. And whether you end up agreeing with it or not, it forces you to think differently about the Bible, archaeology, and ancient Egypt. And frankly, that's half the fun. So, hey, cheers! Let's dive in. Chapter 1. What if we've been looking in the wrong Egypt? Maybe spending 200 years searching for your missing wallet, only to discover you've been looking in the wrong pair of pants. That's basically David Rohl's argument. For generations, biblical archaeology has been built on two enormous assumptions. Number one, the biblical pharaoh Shishak is the Egyptian king Shoshenq I. That's one. Number two, Ramses II must have been the pharaoh of the Exodus. Must have been. Now, those two ideas became the foundation for nearly every timeline connecting Egypt and the Bible. But Rohl comes along and politely says, what if both assumptions are wrong? Cue the sound of every historian nervously reaching for another drink, because if he's right, then everything moves. Joseph moves. Moses moves. The Exodus moves. Jericho moves. The conquest moves. Suddenly, we're no longer in Egypt's greatest imperial age. We're centuries earlier, during the Middle Kingdom. Now, that's a pretty bold claim. So where does Rohl begin? Oddly enough, not with pyramids, not with the Bible, not even with Egypt. He begins with the sky. You see, ancient Mesopotamian astronomers recorded an exceptionally rare double eclipse, a double eclipse. Now, modern astronomers can calculate exactly when those eclipses occurred. It's like finding a timestamp carved into history itself. Using that astronomical anchor, Rohl argues that the reign of Pharaoh Neferhotep I, good name, Neferhotep I, can be fixed with surprising precision. And from there, the entire 13th dynasty falls into place like dominoes. And once that happens, Joseph suddenly appears in a completely different Egypt. Chapter 2. Egypt's problem wasn't too little water. Here's something that surprised me. When we hear that Joseph was predicting 7 years of famine, we immediately picture dry riverbeds, dust storms, cracked earth, everybody looking nervously at the sky. But famine isn't always caused by drought. Sometimes it's caused by too much water. Okay, imagine the Nile refusing to cooperate. Instead of its normal, predictable flood, it keeps overflowing and overflowing and overflowing. Fields stay underwater. Villages disappear beneath muddy water. Granaries collapse. Roads become rivers, and crops rot before they're harvested. Too much water can starve a nation just as effectively as too little. Well, during the reign of Pharaoh Amenemhat III, another good name, Amenemhat III, Egypt appears to have experienced years of extraordinary Nile inundations. And if that's true, then Egypt needed more than prayers. It needed an engineer. Fortunately, Genesis tells us that Pharaoh already had one, already had a good engineer. Scripture break.
Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land. Let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under Pharaoh's authority, to be kept in the cities for food.
Chapter 3. Joseph builds a nation. Now, according to Rohl, Joseph wasn't merely Egypt's chief economist. He may have been its chief engineer. Southwest of the Nile lies a great natural depression known as the Fayum. The Fayum. Think of it as nature's giant overflow basin. During Amenemhat III's reign, enormous canals and barrages were built to divert excess Nile water into this basin, preventing northern Egypt from becoming one giant swamp. And here's where things get really interesting. The main canal still carries a traditional name. It's called Bahr Yussef, the Waterway of Joseph. Now, does that prove that Joseph built it? Well, of course not. Traditions can develop centuries later, but it's certainly an eyebrow-raising coincidence, especially when we discover something else. The official overseeing agricultural administration during this very period was a remarkable fellow named Ankhu. Ankhu. Now remember that name because Rohl thinks that Ankhu is in fact Joseph. Brings us to chapter 4. Meet Ankhu. Egyptian records describe Ankhu as one of the greatest officials in the Middle Kingdom. He began as the overseer of fields. Think minister of agriculture. Eventually, he became vizier. In other words, prime minister of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. Sound familiar? Genesis tells us that Joseph received an Egyptian name. Traditionally, we know it as Zaphenath-Paaneah. Tongue twister, especially with a beer. Zaphenath-Paaneah. Scholars have debated its meaning for centuries. Rohl proposes something different. He suggests that the biblical text may preserve the phrase, he who is called Ankhu. He who is called Ankhu. Even more fascinating, the word Ankhu means the living one. The living one. Now, remember Jacob. For years, he believed that Joseph, his son, had died. Then suddenly, Joseph stands before him, alive. Now, if Pharaoh really bestowed a title meaning the one who lives, that's either an extraordinary coincidence or a remarkably beautiful piece of symbolism. Chapter 5. Joseph's greatest achievement. Here's where Joseph becomes far more interesting than the children's Bible version. Most Sunday school lessons end with Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, but Genesis doesn't. Joseph proceeds to reorganize the entire Egyptian economy. He creates a national grain reserve. He establishes regional administrators. He builds storage facilities. He organizes transportation. He develops labor. Egyptian records describe something remarkably similar. An institution called the Department of the People's Giving. The Department of the People's Giving. Its purpose? To organize state agricultural labor. Workers harvested grain. They maintained canals. They filled granaries. They served whatever the kingdom needed. It's difficult not to notice how closely that resembles Joseph's biblical reforms. Another round from Genesis.
So Joseph bought all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh. The Egyptians, one and all, sold their fields because the famine was too severe for them. The land became Pharaoh's, and Joseph reduced the people to servitude from one end of Egypt to the other. So Joseph established it as a law concerning land in Egypt, still in force today, that a fifth of the produce belongs to Pharaoh.
This isn't just a famine story anymore. It's a political revolution. Joseph is quietly transforming Egypt into one of history's earliest centralized states. Chapter 6. The House of Joseph. Now, the story becomes almost cinematic. Joseph doesn't disappear after his death. His family keeps running Egypt. Rohl describes Joseph's sons as Egyptian officials named Resheneb and Imeru. Resheneb and Imeru. Generation after generation, Joseph's family remains at the center of government, while more than 20 kings occupy Egypt's throne. Imagine that. The politicians come and go, but the civil servants stay. Apparently, some things never change. During this period, the Israelites flourish, which suddenly makes perfect sense. The family of Jacob isn't just living in Egypt, they're connected to the highest office in the kingdom. No wonder the Bible says it like this.
The Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them.
Political stability tends to help. Chapter 7. We may have found Goshen. You see, for years, Critics insisted that there was no archaeological evidence for Israel in Egypt. Zero, none, nada. Then came the Austrian excavations at Tel el-Daba. Tel el-Daba. What emerged from the sand surprised everybody. Entire neighborhoods of Semitic-style homes, family compounds, distinctive burials, imported pottery from Canaan, evidence of rapid population growth. This ancient city was known as Avaris. Avaris. Now, Rohl argues that this is the biblical land of Goshen. Even more intriguing, archaeologists uncovered an enormous palace, a grand entrance supported by 12 columns. Nearby stood the fragments of a colossal statue, a figure that had an unmistakably Asiatic appearance. It wasn't an Egyptian noble. It represented someone from the Levant. Even more curious, the statue appears to have been painted with a multicolored garment. Now, before anyone starts saying they found Joseph, slow down. Archaeology doesn't quite work that way. There is no inscription that says, property of Joseph, son of Jacob. But if Rohl is correct, this palace may have belonged to the greatest Hebrew who ever lived before Moses. And that's a pretty remarkable possibility. Chapter 8. When everything fell apart. Unfortunately, golden ages don't last forever. After the death of Queen Sobekneferu, another nice word, nice name, Sobekneferu, the last ruler of Egypt's 12th dynasty, something extraordinary happened. The Turin king list begins preserving rulers with unmistakably Asiatic Semitic names. Foreigners were ruling Egypt. But eventually, the pendulum swung back. A military commander named Memesha seized power. The last Semitic king disappeared. Native Egyptian rulers returned, and suddenly, the Bible's most chilling sentence makes perfect historical sense.
Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph.
Not necessarily because he'd never heard the name, but because Joseph belonged to the previous regime. The old administration was gone. Its allies became enemies. Its descendants became suspects. History has repeated this pattern many times. Revolutions have very short memories. Chapter 9. Joseph accidentally created the system that enslaved his own people. And that may be the saddest twist in the whole theory. Joseph created a nationwide agricultural system, labor system. Families served temporary periods working for the state. It wasn't slavery. It was compulsory public service. But after Joseph's family lost power, nothing prevented later rulers from changing the rules. Temporary labor became permanent labor. Corvée labor, as it's called, became slavery. The descendants of Joseph found themselves trapped inside the very bureaucracy their ancestor had designed to save Egypt. That's almost Shakespearean. The hero's greatest achievement becomes the instrument of his family's downfall. The Brooklyn Papyrus, as it's called, dating centuries later, lists numerous Semitic slaves bearing names that resemble those associated with Joseph's family and other Israelite traditions. Rohl suggests that these may represent later generations of the same Israelite clans. whether or not that identification is correct, the irony remains pretty powerful. The house that once governed Egypt now appears among the slaves of Egypt. How about that? Well, it's closing time. The Bible tells us that before Joseph died, he made one request. Not wealth, not monuments, not titles. All he said was this:
God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place.
Centuries later, Moses did exactly that. Imagine the scene. The descendants of slaves leaving Egypt under cover of night. Among them, a coffin. Inside rested the man who had once saved the kingdom. Maybe that's the greatest irony of the whole story. Joseph entered Egypt as a slave, rose to become its greatest administrator. He saved an empire. He built canals. He created granaries. He reshaped the whole government. He founded a family dynasty and eventually left Egypt once again. Not in a royal procession, but carried on the shoulders of a free people heading home. Now, whether David Rohl's new chronology ultimately proves correct is a question historians continue to debate. It remains a minority view, and many Egyptologists disagree with its revised dates and historical identifications. But one thing is for sure: it challenges us to look at familiar stories with fresh eyes. And remember that archaeology is an ongoing investigation. It's not a finished book. And honestly, that's what makes history so much fun. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Biblical Mysteries on Tap. Next time, grab another drink because we've got another ancient mystery waiting at the bottom of the glass. Cheers.
If you appreciated this episode, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to Jews, God and History, because the past isn't dead. It's waiting.